Get her out. She is making the guests uncomfortable. The manager said it quietly, leaning into his host's ear the way men lean when they want cruelty to sound like procedure. He straightened his tie. He adjusted his cuffs. And he walked back toward the kitchen as if he had just resolved a minor issue with a wine delivery rather than ordered the removal of a human being from his dining room. The woman he was talking about was sitting at table 9. She was not causing a disturbance. She was not raising her voice. She was not drunk or disorderly or doing anything that any reasonable person would describe as problematic. She was sitting in a wheelchair, reading a menu, waiting for her husband. Her name was Clara Marchetti. She was 32 years old. She had dark hair that she had spent an hour curling because tonight was supposed to be special. She was wearing a navy blue dress that her husband had laid on the bed that morning with a note that said, "Wear this tonight. You will understand why later." She had laughed at the note because her husband was not a man who wrote notes. He was a man who gave orders and made decisions and moved through the world with the force of someone who had long ago stopped asking permission for anything. But for Clara, he wrote notes. For Clara, he did things that the rest of his world would never believe because the rest of his world knew him only as Dante Marchetti. And Dante Marchetti was not a man associated with tenderness. But we will get to Dante. We will get to what happened when 3 black SUVs pulled up to the curb and the most feared man in the city stepped out and saw his wife sitting on the sidewalk in the cold. We will get to the moment when every person inside that restaurant understood that they had made the worst mistake of their lives. First, you need to see what they did to her. Because the ending only means what it means if you feel the middle. Subscribe right now. Right now? Because this story is going to build like a wave, and when it breaks, you need to be here. Subscribe and stay. The restaurant was called Aubergine. It occupied the ground floor of a renovated bank building in the heart of the city's wealthiest district. The ceiling was 20 feet high. The chandeliers were crystal. The tables were spaced far enough apart that conversations remained private and close enough together that guests could admire each other's clothes and jewelry and the particular performance of affluence that places like Aubergine exist to facilitate. Clara had arrived at 7:15. Alone. Dante was running late. He had called her 40 minutes earlier, his voice carrying the clipped, controlled tension that she had learned to recognize as the sound of a man handling something that required his specific attention. He did not tell her what it was. He never did. And she did not ask. That was the agreement. That was the architecture of their marriage. He kept his world away from her. She let him. "Go ahead," he had said. "Get the table. Order the wine. I will be there." "How late?" "Not very. I promise. You know I do not like going alone." "I know. But you are the bravest person I have ever met. And Aubergine does not deserve you. But I made the reservation and the chef is making something special, and I need you to go and be beautiful and wait for me. Can you do that? You are trying to charm me, so I will not be angry. Is it working?" Slightly. She had gone. Because despite everything, despite the fear that lived in the margins of loving a man like Dante, despite the wheelchair that turned every public outing into a negotiation between her dignity and the world's discomfort, Clara Marchetti was not a woman who hid from things. She had not hidden from the accident that took her legs at 27. She had not hidden from the rehabilitation that followed, the months of learning to navigate a world redesigned for bodies that could stand. She had not hidden from the stares or the whispers or the specific silence that falls over a room when a wheelchair enters it, the silence of people recalculating their assumptions in real time. She did not hide. She arrived. Every time. In every room. She arrived. The host at Aubergine was a young man named Julian who had been trained to greet guests with a warmth calibrated to their perceived spending capacity. Julian looked at Clara. He looked at the wheelchair. And his calibration shifted. "Welcome to Aubergine. Do you have a reservation?" "Marchetti. 7:30. Julian checked the book. He found the name. The reservation was for the main dining room, center table, the one positioned beneath the largest chandelier, the table that was given to guests the restaurant wanted to showcase because their presence enhanced the room's prestige. Julian looked at the center table. He looked at Clara's wheelchair. He performed the calculation that people like Julian perform when reality does not match the expectation his training prepared him for. Then he smiled. "Mrs. Marchetti, the center table may present some challenges with your chair. May I suggest something closer to the back? More private, more comfortable." Clara had heard this before. Every restaurant, Every theater, every public space she entered performed this choreography, the gentle redirection, the compassionate demotion, the framing of exclusion as consideration. I would like the table we reserved, please. Of course. Let me just check with the manager. He left. He returned with the manager, a man named Victor Hale. Victor was 46 years old. He had managed Aubergine for 3 years, and in those 3 years had built a reputation for running the most exclusive dining experience in the city, which meant, in practice, that he had built a reputation for deciding who belonged and who did not, and enforcing that decision with the polished authority of a man who had confused taste with morality. Victor approached Clara with the smile. The specific smile. The one that says I am about to deny you something while making it sound like I am giving you something. Mrs. Marchetti, welcome. I understand there is a concern about the table assignment. There is no concern. I would like the center table. The center table is in an area with narrow spacing between tables. Your chair may obstruct the flow for our servers and our other guests. For everyone's comfort, I would recommend. I would like the center table. Victor's smile hardened. Not dramatically, by approximately 2 degrees. The shift from manufactured warmth to manufactured patience. Mrs. Marchetti, I have to consider the experience of all our guests. And I am one of your guests. Of course. Which is why I want to ensure you are seated somewhere appropriate. Appropriate. The word landed on Clara like a hand on her shoulder, pressing down. Appropriate. The word that the world uses when it wants to exclude you without admitting that exclusion is what it is doing. The word that transforms discrimination into logistics and prejudice into policy. She was seated at a table near the back, near the kitchen, near the door that the staff used to carry out trash. The table was smaller. The lighting was dimmer. The chair across from her, the one where Dante would sit, had a wobbly leg that clicked against the floor every time it was touched. She sat there for 20 minutes. Subscribe now. Because what happened at minute 21 is the reason Clara ended up on the sidewalk, and what happened after that is the reason Aubergine no longer exists. Subscribe. At minute 21, a waiter approached her table. Not with food. Not with wine. With Victor behind him. Victor and 2 other staff members, standing in a formation that was less service and more intervention. Mrs. Marchetti, Victor said, I have received concerns from several of our guests regarding. He paused, selecting his words with the care of a man assembling a legal defense. Regarding the accessibility situation, several diners have expressed that they are finding it difficult to navigate around your chair, and I am afraid that for the safety and comfort of everyone, I am going to have to ask you to conclude your visit for this evening. Clara looked at him. She looked at the waiter. She looked at the 2 staff members flanking Victor like a security detail for a man whose only threat was a woman who could not stand up. You are asking me to leave. I am asking you to allow us to assist you to the exit so that we can address the accessibility concerns and perhaps welcome you back on an evening when we are better prepared to accommodate your needs. Every word was chosen. Every syllable was designed to make the removal sound like a service, to make the expulsion sound like hospitality, to make the act of throwing a woman in a wheelchair out of a restaurant sound like the restaurant was doing her a favor. Clara did not move, because moving would mean agreeing. Moving would mean accepting that her body was the problem. Moving would mean confirming what Victor and Julian and every guest who had complained believed, that a wheelchair in a dining room was an obstruction rather than a person. So Victor moved her. He nodded to the 2 staff members. They stepped forward. One positioned himself behind her wheelchair. The other walked ahead to hold doors. And they rolled Clara Marchetti through the dining room of Aubergine, past 37 guests who watched in silence, past tables set with crystal and silver, past candles that flickered as her chair passed, past every face that saw and every mouth that said nothing, and out the front door. They left her on the sidewalk. The door closed behind her. And Clara sat in the November air in her navy blue dress with her hair curled and her earrings catching the streetlight and her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair so hard that her knuckles turned white. And she did not cry, because Clara Marchetti had decided a long time ago that the world did not get to see her cry. But the world was about to see something else. Drop a comment right now. Tell me how you feel. Tell me what you would have done if you were sitting at one of those 37 tables. Be honest. And subscribe because Dante Marchetti is 11 minutes away, and what he does when he arrives is going to be permanently seared into your memory. Stay. Dante Marchetti received the phone call at 7:48. He was in the back seat of his vehicle, heading toward Aubergine, reviewing a document on his phone that concerned a matter of business he would resolve by morning. His driver, a man named Sal who had been with Dante for 14 years, was navigating traffic with the patient efficiency of someone who understood that the man in the back seat valued precision over speed. Dante's phone rang. He looked at the screen. "Clara, I am 10 minutes away. Did you order that?" They threw me out. 2 beats of silence. If you had been sitting next to Dante Marchetti in that moment, you would have witnessed something remarkable. Not movement, not sound. The opposite. You would have witnessed the complete cessation of all non-essential functions in a human being. His breathing slowed. His posture changed. The document on his phone ceased to exist. The business matter ceased to exist. The entire architecture of his evening, his week, his empire, restructured itself in approximately 1.5 seconds around a single new priority. "Where are you?" "On the sidewalk." "Outside." "They put you outside." "Yes." A pause that contained more violence than most men's outbursts. A silence so dense it had its own gravity. "Do not move. I am coming." He hung up. He did not call her back. He did not ask for details. He did not need them. The details would come later. The details would be extracted from every person involved with the methodical thoroughness that Dante applied to everything he considered important. And nothing in his entire life, was more important than the woman who had just told him she was sitting on a sidewalk in November because a restaurant had decided she did not deserve to be inside it. Sal. Boss. Aubergine. Now. Sal did not ask why. 14 years had taught him that the word now in Dante's vocabulary carried a weight that made questions irrelevant. He changed lanes. He accelerated. Not dramatically. By exactly the amount necessary to arrive at the destination in the minimum possible time without attracting the attention of law enforcement. Because Dante's operations required discretion at all times, even when the operation was personal, even when the operation was driven by something that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the woman he loved. Dante made 2 calls. The first was to Tommaso, his head of security. The conversation lasted 11 seconds. The second was to a man named Enzo, who handled logistical matters that fell outside the scope of traditional business. That conversation lasted 8 seconds. Then Dante sat in the back of his vehicle and looked out the window at the city passing by, the city he controlled, the city that operated within a framework he had spent 20 years constructing, and he thought about Clara. Subscribe right now. I need you to subscribe because understanding what Dante does next requires understanding what Clara means to him. And what Clara means to him is not something his reputation prepares you for. Subscribe and listen. He met Clara 4 years ago, at a physical therapy clinic. Not as a patient, as a visitor. His mother had been recovering from a hip replacement, and Dante had come to the clinic because his mother was the one person in his life whose requests functioned as commands. She wanted her son to visit. So her son visited. Clara was in the adjacent room. He could hear her through the wall. Not her voice. Her effort. The sound of a woman working to rebuild a body that had been rebuilt and broken and rebuilt again. The sound of breathing pushed past its comfortable limit. The sound of muscles being asked to perform tasks they were not sure they could perform. The sound of someone refusing to accept the word impossible as a permanent condition. He had stood in the hallway and listened. And something in the sound had reached a part of him that he did not know was accessible. A part that lived beneath the business and the power and the carefully maintained exterior of a man who could not afford softness because softness in his world was interpreted as vulnerability, and vulnerability was a door through which enemies entered. He found her in the lobby afterward. She was in her wheelchair. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was flushed from exertion. She was drinking water from a paper cup and reading a book, and she looked up when he approached, and she did not look at him the way people usually looked at him, with the recalculating deference of someone identifying a threat. She looked at him the way she looked at everything. Directly. Without adjustment. Without the micro-expressions of fear or submission that his presence typically generated. "Can I help you?" she had said. "I heard you through the wall." "Heard me what?" "Working." That is a strange thing to tell a stranger. "I am a strange man." She had almost smiled. Almost. The corner of her mouth had moved by a fraction that most people would not have detected, but that Dante detected, because Dante detected everything. It was the first time he had made a woman almost smile and felt it in his chest like a detonation. They talked for 20 minutes. He learned that she had been a dancer before the accident. A dancer. A woman whose entire life had been built on the relationship between her body and movement. And that relationship had been severed at 27 by a drunk driver and a highway and 4 seconds that divided her existence into a before and an after that shared nothing in common except her refusal to stop. He fell in love with her that afternoon. Not slowly. Not gradually. Completely. The way a man who has spent his entire life in control of everything encounters the one thing he cannot control and surrenders to it with the terrified, exhilarating recognition that surrender is not weakness but the acknowledgement of something stronger than himself. They married 8 months later. He built her a life that accommodated everything. Ramps. Modified vehicles. A home designed by an architect who understood that accessibility was not a concession but a principle. He gave her everything his resources could provide, and in return, she gave him the one thing his resources could not purchase: the experience of being known. Not feared, not respected, not obeyed. Known. Seen by a woman who looked at him without the filter of his reputation and saw the man underneath. The man who wrote notes and laid dresses on beds and learned to braid hair by watching videos on his phone because Clara's hands cramped sometimes and she needed help, and Dante Marchetti would rather learn to braid hair than allow his wife to struggle with something he could solve. That was the man sitting in the back of the vehicle heading toward Aubergine. Not the man the city knew. Not the figure whose name changed the temperature of rooms. The man who braided his wife's hair. The man who knelt beside her wheelchair every morning and helped her with her shoes because the angle was difficult, and because touching her feet was an act of intimacy that he guarded as fiercely as any territory in his empire. That was the man who was about to walk into a restaurant that had put his wife on a sidewalk. And God help everyone inside. The 3 vehicles arrived at 7:59. They lined up at the curb with the synchronized precision of a formation that had been executed hundreds of times. Sal parked. Tommaso exited the lead vehicle. 2 men from the 3rd vehicle took positions at the restaurant's entrance. Dante stepped out. He saw her immediately, 20 feet away, under a streetlight, in the navy blue dress. In the wheelchair he had commissioned from a designer in Milan because he wanted her chair to be beautiful, because he refused to let the thing that carried his wife through the world look medical or institutional or like an apology. Her chair was a statement. It said, "The woman sitting in this chair is extraordinary, and the chair she sits in should reflect that." She was not crying. He could see that from 20 feet away. She was not crying because Clara did not cry in public. Clara cried at home, in their bedroom, in the dark, where she allowed herself the vulnerability that the daytime world would not accommodate. And Dante knew this because he held her during those moments, held her in their bed while she wept from frustration and exhaustion and the relentless, grinding work of being disabled in a world that treats disability as a personal failing rather than a structural one. She was not crying, but her knuckles were white on the armrests. And that was worse, because the white knuckles meant she was holding everything inside, compressing it, storing it in the place where she kept the things that were too heavy for tears, and Dante knew that place because he had one too. And the things stored there were the things that eventually demand to be addressed, one way or another. He walked to her. He knelt, on the pavement, in his suit, without hesitation, without consideration of who might be watching or what it looked like for a man of his position to kneel on a public sidewalk. He knelt because his wife was below his eye level and he wanted to look at her directly, face to face, equal to equal, the way he always looked at her, the way he insisted on looking at her, because looking down at Clara was something he would never do and would never allow anyone else to do. He took her hands. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him about Julian and the redirection, about Victor and the word appropriate, about the table near the kitchen, about the concerns from guests, about the hands on her wheelchair, about the 37 people who watched and the door that closed and the pavement and the cold. She told him without emotion, factually, the way you give a report, because she knew what her husband was, and she knew that emotion would cloud the information, and the information was what he needed to do what he was about to do. Dante listened. His thumbs moved slowly across her knuckles. The only movement he made. The only sign that the information was landing and being processed and being converted into something that the people inside Aubergine were not prepared for. When she finished, he stood. He removed his coat. He draped it over her legs. He kissed her forehead. 1 minute, he said. Subscribe. This is it. This is the moment. Subscribe right now because Dante Marchetti is about to walk through that door, and what happens inside is going to be the most satisfying thing you have heard in a very long time. Do it. Subscribe and stay. Dante walked into Aubergine at 8:03. The door opened and he entered the way he entered every room, with a stillness that preceded him like a change in pressure, the way the air shifts before a storm arrives, the way animals go quiet before an earthquake. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The announcement was his presence. The announcement was the 3 vehicles outside and the 2 men at the entrance, and the fact that Dante Marchetti did not visit restaurants at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, without the visit meaning something. Julian was at the host stand. He saw Dante, and the recognition was immediate, not because Julian knew Dante personally, but because Julian worked in the service industry in a city where knowing certain faces was a survival skill, and Dante Marchetti's face was at the top of that curriculum. Julian's body reacted before his mind caught up. His posture changed. His hands found the reservation book and gripped it the way a drowning man grips a piece of driftwood. Mr. Marchetti, good evening. Welcome to. Dante walked past him, through the archway, into the dining room. 37 guests were seated at their tables, engaged in conversations and courses, and the performance of an evening that was about to end. He walked to the center of the room, the table that had been reserved for his wife, the table under the chandelier, the table that Victor had decided Clara did not deserve. He stood beside it, and the room noticed. Conversations stopped the way lights go out during a power failure, one by one, and then all at once. Forks lowered. Glasses paused mid-sip. 37 faces turned toward the man standing alone under the chandelier with an expression that contained nothing. Not anger. Not violence. Not the theatrical fury that lesser men perform when they want the world to know they are upset. Nothing. An absence so complete it functioned as a presence. The void where emotion should have been. And the void was worse than any emotion because it meant the emotional processing was finished. The decision was made. What remained was execution. Victor Hale emerged from near the kitchen. He had been informed. Julian had sent a busboy to warn him. Victor walked toward Dante with the measured steps of a man approaching something he cannot avoid, and his face carried the expression of a person who has just realized that the minor issue he resolved 30 minutes ago was not minor at all. It was, in fact, the single worst decision of his professional life. Mr. Marchetti, Victor said. Sir, I want to assure you that any misunderstanding regarding your wife's visit this evening was entirely. Stop talking. Victor stopped. The words died in his mouth. Not because of volume. Dante had not raised his voice. He had spoken at the same level one might use to order coffee. But the instruction carried a weight that made Victor's vocal cords simply cease to function. You removed my wife from this restaurant, Dante said. You put your hands on her wheelchair. You rolled her through a room full of people who watched and did nothing. And you left her on the sidewalk. Each sentence was delivered with identical cadence, identical volume, identical spacing. The rhythm of a man who has organized his words the way he organizes everything, with precision that leaves no room for misinterpretation. Sir, the accessibility concerns were. I told you to stop talking. That was not a suggestion. Victor's mouth closed. Dante looked around the room. Slowly, his gaze moved from table to table, face to face, the way a lighthouse beam sweeps across dark water, illuminating everything it touches and leaving nothing hidden. 37 of you, he said, addressing the room. 37 adults. You watched a woman in a wheelchair get pushed out of a restaurant. You watched the staff put their hands on her chair without her permission. You watched them roll her past your tables and through the door and onto the sidewalk. And not one of you said anything. Not one of you stood up. Not one of you put down your fork and said, stop. Silence. The deepest silence that room had ever held. The kind of silence that has physical properties, that presses against eardrums, that makes the sound of a candle flickering seem like thunder. You are all comfortable, Dante continued. You can afford this restaurant. You can afford the wine and the food and the evening and the belief that your comfort matters more than someone else's dignity. And maybe in your world, it does. But you are in my city. And in my city, the woman you threw out is the most important person alive. He turned back to Victor. This restaurant is closed. Victor's face went through a rapid succession of colors. Red to white to a shade that exists only in the faces of people who are watching their livelihood disintegrate in real time. Mr. Marchetti, please. If I had known she was your wife, if you had known she was my wife, you would have treated her differently. That is the problem, Victor. You would have treated her like a person if you knew she was connected to power. But without that connection, she was just a woman in a wheelchair. And a woman in a wheelchair, in your estimation, does not deserve the same table as everyone else. Subscribe right now, because what Dante said next is the sentence that will stay with you long after this story is over. Subscribe. My wife should not need my name to be treated with dignity. No one should need my name. Dignity is not a reservation that requires a connection. It is owed to every person who walks through a door or rolls through a door or is carried through a door. And the fact that you understand this principle only when the person is connected to someone who frightens you tells me everything I need to know about you and about this room. He looked at Julian. Julian was pressed against the host's stand as if trying to merge with the furniture. You redirected her at the door. You looked at her wheelchair and decided she did not fit the aesthetic of your restaurant. You performed the first act of exclusion, and every act that followed was built on yours. Julian's eyes were wet. Not from remorse, from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that the night was not going to end with an apology and a complimentary bottle of wine. The night was going to end with consequences that his training had not prepared him for, because his training had only prepared him for customers, and the man standing in front of him was not a customer. Everyone out, Dante said. Guests, staff, everyone. The kitchen closes now. The door's locked tonight. Tomorrow, the lease will be reviewed. The liquor license will be reviewed. Every permit, every inspection, every piece of paper that allows this building to operate as a business will be reviewed. And I will ensure that every review is conducted with the same thoroughness and attention to detail that I apply to everything in my life. He paused. Everything. The room emptied. Guests rose from tables where courses sat half-eaten. Waitstaff removed aprons with the slow, stunned movements of people processing a sudden unemployment. The kitchen went dark. The lights went dim. The chandeliers that had hung over 100 evenings of privilege and exclusivity now hung over nothing but empty tables and the lingering scent of food that no one would finish. Victor remained, standing in the center of his empty restaurant, surrounded by the detritus of an evening that had been, 20 minutes ago, the culmination of everything he had built his career to produce, and was now the wreckage of everything he had failed to understand about the difference between exclusivity and cruelty. Mr. Marchetti, Victor said, and his voice was small now, reduced, the voice of a man who has run out of scripts and is operating without dialogue for the first time. What do you want me to do? Dante looked at him. I want you to go outside. I want you to look at the piece of sidewalk where you left my wife. I want you to stand on it. In the cold. In November. For as long as it takes you to understand what it feels like to be put somewhere you do not belong by someone who decided you do not matter. He turned. And then I want you to spend the rest of your life remembering that you felt that way for 5 minutes. And my wife felt that way for 20. And there are people who feel that way every single day. In every restaurant, and every building, and every room that was designed by people who look like you for people who look like you. And the rest of the world is left on the sidewalk. Dante walked out. He walked to Clara. She was still under the streetlight. Still in the navy blue dress. Still not crying. Still holding everything inside with the white-knuckled determination of a woman who has built her entire post-accident identity on the principle that the world does not get to see her break. He knelt beside her again. Pavement. Cold. Suit. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the woman in the chair and the look on her face that was not sadness and not anger, but something between the two. The look of a person who has been reminded, for the 1000th time, that the world was not built for her, and who is tired of rebuilding herself to fit a world that will not do the same. It is done, he said. You did not have to do that. Yes, I did. Dante, it was just a restaurant. It was not just a restaurant. It was a room full of people who decided you did not belong. And I will empty every room in this city until you never feel that again. She looked at him. At this man kneeling before her on a public street. This man whose name made the city flinch. This man who had just dismantled a business because it had failed to see his wife as a person. She looked at him and she saw what she always saw, what the world never got to see, what lived underneath the reputation and the power and the fear. A man who loved her so completely that her pain was the only thing in his world he could not tolerate. She put her hand on his face. "Take me somewhere warm," she said. "Somewhere with bad lighting and paper napkins and a table big enough for my chair." He smiled. Dante Marchetti, the man who never smiled in public, who maintained an expression of controlled neutrality as a professional necessity, smiled on a sidewalk in November while kneeling in front of a woman in a wheelchair because she asked for paper napkins. "I know a place," he said. He stood. He took the handles of her chair. And he pushed her himself. Down the block. Away from Aubergine. Away from the empty building and the dark chandeliers and the man standing on the sidewalk learning what cold feels like. They ate at a place called Manny's. A diner. Red vinyl booths. A television in the corner playing a basketball game nobody was watching. The door was wide enough for the wheelchair. The owner, a large man named Manny who had no idea who Dante was and treated everyone the same, said, "Sit anywhere you like, sweetheart." And Clara chose a table by the window, and Dante sat across from her, and they ordered cheeseburgers and fries and milkshakes, and Dante reached across the table and held her hand while they waited. "You shut down a restaurant for me," Clara said. "I would shut down the city for you." "I know. That is what worries me." "Why does it worry you?" "Because I do not want the city shut down. I want the city to be better. I want to roll into a restaurant and be seated at the table I reserved without needing your last name to make." It happened. Dante looked at her. He looked at the woman who had been a dancer, who had lost her legs and rebuilt her life, who endured a world that was not designed for her every single day with a grace that made his own power seem like a blunt instrument. "Then we will make it better," he said. "How?" "I do not know yet, but I will figure it out. I figure everything out. Not everything. Name one thing I have not figured out. How to braid hair without pulling too tight." He laughed. Quietly. The laugh that only she could produce. The one that bypassed his defenses and found the human being underneath. He squeezed her hand. "I am still learning," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I stay." The cheeseburgers arrived. They ate. They talked about nothing important. They talked about the kind of things that people talk about when the hard thing has already happened and the soft thing that follows is the reward for surviving it. She stole his fries. He pretended to object. She laughed. He watched her laugh the way he watched everything she did, with the total attention of a man who considered his wife's laughter the most valuable sound in his life. Outside, the city moved on. The city always moves on. Buildings close and open. People are cruel and kind. Rooms are built for certain bodies and closed to others. The world is imperfect and unfair and structured in ways that punish people for things they did not choose and cannot change. But on that night, in a diner with paper napkins and red vinyl booths, a woman in a wheelchair ate a cheeseburger with a man who had just reminded an entire restaurant that dignity is not a privilege reserved for the able-bodied. It is a right, unearnable, unrevocable, owed to every person in every chair, at every table, in every room. And anyone who forgets that lesson in Dante Marchetti's city will be reminded. Permanently. And that is where the story ends. But it does not end here. Not really. It ends with you. If this story made you feel something you did not expect to feel, if it made you think about the rooms you have been in and the people you have watched get pushed to the margins without standing up, then I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that button. Not because I am asking. Because the stories told here are the kind that find the exact place in your chest where the truth lives and press on it until you cannot ignore it anymore. Share this story with someone who uses a wheelchair. Share it with someone who has ever been told they do not belong. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they deserve the center table under the chandelier, and anyone who says otherwise is wrong. Drop a comment. Tell me, have you ever been the person at the table who watched and said nothing? Have you ever been the one who stood up? Have you ever been the one on the sidewalk? Tell me. I read every comment. Every single one matters. And the next story is already built. It is already waiting. And it is going to meet you exactly where you are and refuse to leave until you have felt something real. Subscribe. Stay. I will see you there.